Hello everybody and welcome to a video here on the channel where I'm going to be talking about what Disney has done for fantasy over the recent, borderline century. I know when it comes to a genre of literature or just, fantasy as a whole, even including movies, things like that, people are hesitant to look at a mega corporation like Disney and give them a whole lot of credit, right? Because it's not necessarily the story we want to tell. We want to tell of authors who were underdogs, overcame so much, and were propelled into success. But to ignore what Disney has done to fantasy and the way it's viewed, fairy tales, things along those lines, would be a pretty massive disservice to the history of this genre. And of course, I'm talking from the Western perspective specifically, but let's go ahead and get into their long history and what Disney really did for fantasy as a whole, because they actually go all the way back to the time period where fantasy was still kind of finding even its name, right? These things were still called fairy tales up until after the release of The Hobbit, and right around that time is when Disney got going. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs had already been released well before this, and Disney has been playing a key role in the presentation of fantasy to mainstream audiences ever since. And this actually even includes the other franchises they've bought up and brought into their circle. There's a reason they target the likes of Pixar and Marvel. They like to kind of just bring in anything that can fall under this umbrella, and most of the time that means it's fantasy. So its start was obviously very fairy tale based. That was what the open IPs available to them were, and they just kind of riffed off of the previous authors I mentioned in my other brief history of fantasy video did, and just take these open available legends and turn them into more digestible stories. Disney is massively influenced by Brothers Grimm. They won't even deny that. No one will deny that. Even on Disney's own fandom website, they have a whole page devoted to Brothers Grimm because they're like foundational to the roots of Disney. Hi, Green Screen Daniel here. What Disney often did was sanitize these stories down to be extremely digestible, like the most they possibly could, and then just present them to the biggest audience available. And now, after generations and generations and generations being raised with Disney kind of helming the visions of these fairy tales, how they are perceived and viewed in mass, what we've resulted in is their versions of these fairy tales are the ones that most people know. It's kind of rare to find someone who even knows the original Brothers Grimm version, let alone the one that was passed down for generations and generations and generations before these people decided to sweep them up and put them into these prose written stories. But hold up. You see the pattern here, don't you? They're still finding their Brothers Grimm to this day. Disney, as I said, is this gigantic umbrella, and that umbrella is their formula. And what works in their formula of taking, hey, what's popular for fantasy among younger audiences to maybe slightly older ones, and just bringing it into the fold. This is why they go out of their way to buy things like Pixar, the best competitor they ever had for these type of movies, and Star Wars, Marvel. They're still going to what the tried and true Brothers Grimm-esque adaptation of a fairy tale-like thing and just bringing it to an audience in a new manner, or something that's already existing like Marvel, and just deciding we would like to get money. Think it like this is exactly what happened. What happened to Marvel and Brothers Grimm is almost a one-to-one comparison in my mind. We had a couple authors over here who took established, well-known fairy tales, turned them into prose literature, and started selling them like crazy, and Disney went, yoink, we can do that. Haha, we're great. Except they didn't have to do nearly as much business stuff back then to do that. Over here, though, we have Marvel, a comic book company that started making movies of their stories and making tons of money off of it. And then Disney went, as I said, money. And so they went ahead and scooped it in as well. Star Wars has been a bit messier. I feel like that wouldn't necessarily fit into their formula as well, and there's a whole lot of videos on this platform of why that did not happen or is not happening to fan satisfaction. But I feel this is still the tried and true pattern for Disney, is to just look at what's already working, look at what's digestible to the biggest audience possible, and bring it into the fold to keep the money printing machine going. Now, I've made the case that they're one of the biggest players in the field of fantasy, and with their recent acquisitions of things like Star Wars and Marvel, maybe even to adults as well now. Not necessarily in the literature sense, or definitely looking at fantasy in the broad picture spectrum of like movies and shows and things along those lines. But hey, they do have a lot of books out there that I'm sure do sell very well when you add them all up. But what I'm specifically trying to point out here in this last bit is, while they have been one of the biggest players because of this formula, as I was talking with Tim from Hello Future Me just now about, their influence is pretty minimal. And if you don't subscribe to Hello Future Me, you're a bad person and you should feel bad. Anyway though, I do want to hit on that Disney essentially started the category of this type of animated movie that we see so many companies like DreamWorks still running with to this day. They had influence in certain presentations and maybe even in the way fantasy is adapted, especially earlier on during the Disney Renaissance, etc., etc. But aside from that, it's just not as much as you'd think. It's just not nearly on the level you would think. They have limited themselves in terms of influence. They don't care about that at all. I promise you, if you went to Disneyland and are like, hey, park employee who's probably not paid enough to be here, what do you think about Disney's influence in the fantasy genre? They're gonna go, leave me alone, I'm on my lunch break. They don't care about the influence they're having. The only thing Disney cares about is that they're extraordinarily safe and secure, measured practices of taking something that they can sell to the biggest audience possible is just continuing to work. Basically, by like definition of this practice, something has to have already had its influence for Disney to have brought it into its umbrella. So they kind of are restricted in a way where it's like, these stories are popular, they're selling, their influence has been felt, let's bring them on in. So there's no real way that Disney can take credit because it's already taken effect. Now, things of course get a bit different when we're specifically looking at fantasy aimed towards adults in the visual mediums we're discussing here. Disney hasn't made huge pushes to try and get adults engaged in their content, aside from Marvel, which that just kind of was a welcome, okay, yeah, people like these superhero movies things. Disney is okay to just hit the family market and brainwash kids to the point that even adults will likely come in and watch the movies as well. But when we look at things that were created for adult audiences within the fantasy landscape, it's still pretty much like a free reign Wild West for shows and movies right now. Obviously, we're seeing it proven that yes, you can do dark, gritty fantasy shows and get people invested, but there's no one player who dominates. HBO did for a minute, but now we're seeing the likes of Amazon and Netflix and etc., etc., etc. see this proven market and try and aggressively jump at it. Curiously though, we haven't seen Disney do the same. I would say the biggest move we've seen from them to make like an adult original fantasy thing to try and sweep people in could maybe be The Mandalorian, but even that is definitely safe for kids and they're not trying to market it as this like dark, gritty, real, no, because that is the biggest face of the show and is there for a very specific reason. Still, probably one of the most impressive marketing characters I've seen in my lifetime, my god. So the concluding thoughts in this video about Disney's influence for the fantasy genre largely is not as much as you'd think. Now, these sub-companies they've brought in their fold, like Star Wars, like Pixar, like Marvel, are doing a lot more. But the reason they're now operating in this Disney bubble is that they proved they're viable. And so I wouldn't even give the credit to Disney there, because the influence was already made before they kind of purchased them for the equation. So instead, they're just another asset that Disney launches into their machine and starts the printing process of money from. Now, I'm going to get two very large pieces of pushback for the points that I'm making here. And I don't think they're entirely invalid, but I just think they're kind of missing the mark. The first of which is going to be, well, they have to have been massively influential. Look at all the money, all the products, all the theme parks. But that's not influence on fantasy. That's influence on media and entertainment in more large, broad strokes ways. If we're talking about taking stories and selling them, yeah, Disney absolutely changed the game on that. The second of which is going to be, well, there's certainly structure to certain Disney types of stories that have been felt. And that's why I've never said that Disney's had no influence. That's not the point of this video. Disney has had some influences that I haven't gotten into the nuances of, but I'm talking about comparatively to the amount of money they make, to the prevalence they have in our media and day-to-day lives. It's pretty minuscule compared to what you think it would be, because that's not their intent. Disney has never been and will never be a company that pushes the boundaries of storytelling. It will find the people who have done that and bring it into their ecosystem to then profit off of and push forward their, as I said, money printing machine go bah structure. And I think you even prove this point further by looking at the money side of things. Yeah, they take things they know they can add to their theme parks, build toys for, sell during the holidays. That's why it's so important things are already proven. They don't want to buy something and just keep writing a book or making a movie. It's about taking something they know can be made into every aspect of selling to children possible, my God, piece of storytelling. And that's not something you can really do with The Fringe, right? I'm not the most well-researched in this. This is based off of like 2 days of Googling and being interested in this idea. So if I'm missing something key, let me know in the comments down below, but I couldn't find much that contradicts this idea. They have their safe space, they've exploited it to an extraordinary extent, and they seem rather comfortable to stay there. They're not going to be competing for this adult space because why the hell would they really need to when Marvel's already doing it for them? And that was a purchase they made a while ago that has worked out quite well. And I'm really interested to see what they might purchase next. I know they've tried to like extend their little tendril of Disney into many franchises and properties before, but it's often been rejected. So I'm always curious to see where that Disney arm is going to go and bring the next sphere into the equation. Anyway, guys, let me know what you think of this in the comments down below. Like and subscribe if you have not already. Hit the Patreon if you want to support what I do here. And have a good one, y'all. Peace.